Hello, I'm Jurgita Bicheka, Commercial Director at Euromonitor International, and today I'm joined by my colleagues Maria Mascaraque, Food Industry Manager, Howard Telford, Senior Soft Drinks Manager, and Rosemarie Downey, Packaging Industry Manager. We will discuss the drivers of environmental sustainability regulations in food and drinks industries and implications on businesses and consumers. It is hard to find a company in any sector that has not yet deployed some kind of sustainability practice. However, while some companies undertake voluntary innovation ahead of legislation to improve their competitive advantage and mitigate unexpected risks, pressure from stakeholders, including consumers, is not enough to force companies to uphold their sustainability pledges, especially at a time of such unexpected economic shock following the pandemic. It seems today that most businesses are less proactive and are more likely to engage in sustainability-specific innovations only in response to increasingly stringent sustainability requirements or enforcements. What are the most pressing environmental challenges in food and drinks that drive these more stringent regulations? Maria, let's start with you.
Thank you, Jurgita. Yes, there are different areas where we've seen a stringent regulation or upcoming regulation that will be coming into force. So one of the key areas is around deforestation and biodiversity laws. This is obviously a key challenge in the food industry. As we know, the expansion of agricultural land is the major driver of deforestation and forest degradation. So this is largely associated with the production of commodities. So you think about cattle, palm oil, cocoa, soybeans. So these really contribute to deforestation. So in light of this, we've seen how legislatures have a strong focus on restoring soils to health and reversing biodiversity loss to create more sustainable food production. So that would be a key area. Then another important area would be around farming-related greenhouse gas emissions. So again, this is a large contributor to climate change, and this obviously has spurred legislation and company pledges on this front as well. So as we know, pollutant gases, especially nitrogen compounds, are emitted to the atmosphere from agricultural activities, including fertilizer use, farm machinery, livestock farming, largely cattle. So all of these is seeing certain regulation coming into place. And another pressing challenge in the spotlight for legislators is food waste. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, 1/3 of the food produced globally goes to waste. This is obviously a lot. So reduction of food waste has extensive potential for reducing the resources used for food production and ultimately lowering the environmental footprint of food production and consumption as well.
And just to build on Maria's point about that issue of waste, when we think about food and particularly the beverages industry, a major issue is packaging waste. In global soft drinks, we produce about 500 billion PET bottles, more than 150 billion metal beverage cans as well. And this has been an area where we've seen new standards, certainly on the legislative side, and new commitments from suppliers in the industry. So in terms of other pressing issues when it comes to food and beverages, I'd also add to what Maria said, issues of water use and water scarcity. So the sale of packaged water, the sale of bottled water, that might only have a marginal impact on global water use compared to things like industrial or agricultural sectors. But we know consumer activism and local action on things like extraction rights is increasing. So here in the US, we've had efforts in California, for instance, to limit Nestle's spring water extraction in the San Bernardino forest. And also similarly, if you look in France, we've seen environmental groups accusing Danone of increasing their rate of extraction from the Volvic bottling facility beyond sustainable levels. And then one final thing I'd add, maybe longer term, I think we'll also see regulators looking at the impact of climate change on food and beverage agriculture, and particularly the really outsized impact of climate issues on coffee and tea growing regions, because demand for those products continues to grow. And so, of course, in these categories, we're talking about growing and shipping commodity crops in really climate vulnerable regions, very long distances to satisfy that demand, in many cases using very low income labor as well. And so if we move to a future of less arable land for these crops, that might force us to think about alternative to those ingredients as well.
You both mentioned waste, either food or packaging, as one of the most pressing challenges. Let's start with the food waste. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, an estimated 1.3 billion tons of food is wasted globally each year, meaning that natural resources that are not needed are used, generating unnecessary pollution. Maria, what are the ways to reduce food waste? And how is this overall being regulated?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've seen actually some legislation to reduce food waste already in place, but also underway. So, for example, in the EU, we have a strategy called the EU Farm to Fork strategy, and these will propose by the end of next year, so 2023, legally binding targets to reduce food waste across the EU. These will be defined against baseline data collected from the EU members on food waste level. This data is expected to be available this year, and that would help build that comparison and build those targets. Another area where we've seen, certain regulation coming into place is a revision of the EU rules on date marking use by date or best before dates, and this is expected by the end of this year. So regulation with the aim of reducing food waste we've seen is underway in some regions in the EU, for example, but it's not something new. I like an example coming from France in trying to fight against food waste. And this country adopted a law in 2016, so like a while back, where supermarkets are forbidden to destroy unsold food and are compelled to donate it instead. So obviously all of these initiatives are really helping to reduce food waste overall.
Thank you, Maria. Well, we also know the beverage industry has an outsized impact on the creation of plastic waste pollution from the rapid growth of plastic and used packaging materials. Rosemarie, what are the new regulatory initiatives to remedy this crisis?
It's true, Jurgita, as you've said, and Howard too, the beverage industry and particularly soft drinks has been at the forefront of concern, scrutiny when it comes down to plastic waste. Understandably so when you consider that soft drinks is the largest retail industry user of rigid plastic bottles. So with plastic success in use, we unfortunately have its very visible presence as environmental waste. But current regulation is a positive facilitator of progress, with laws targeting plastic recyclability, recycling, and reuse. And Europe is by far leading the way on regulation in beverages. So we have as key regulation the Single-Use Plastic Directive that specifically targets beverages and is really fairly extensive in its coverage. So if we think about maybe two areas, most imminently by July 24, so that's just in 2 years' time from now, all soft drinks bottles under 3 litres in size sold in the region must have their cap tethered to the bottle. So that means attached to the bottle. And why is that? So that the cap stays with the bottle. They get recycled together. The cap does not end up floating, littering the environment. And this is a sizable undertaking with lots of testing and transitions to tethered caps already well underway. Coca-Cola Deutschland with launches earlier this year, and just in the last couple of weeks, Coca-Cola Great Britain announcing production of bottles with tethered caps. So that's one area. For the Single-Use Plastic Directive, another milestone, by 2025, all plastic PET bottles must contain a minimum of 25% recycled content. And collection of those bottles is also set to reach, or is targeted to reach 77% by 2025. So there's lots of work and investment really required to reach those targets and get beyond European recycling rate that we have currently and in recent years, which is averaging at about 58%. And if we look a little bit beyond Europe, we have regulation, of course, in other regions too, some country-led, some even state-led regulatory initiatives. And the US is an interesting one too, where we're seeing a rise in regulation. And it's important if we think that US is actually the world's second largest user of plastic soft drinks packaging. Here, I'd say California is a clear front runner, having announced its bottle bill back in August 2020, mandating at that time a 15% recycled content for plastics drinks bottles, effective as of the beginning of this year, and that rate is set to rise to half of all bottles by 2030. So it's really interesting how we're seeing drinks players like the Coca-Cola Company, PepsiCo, Danone, many others even go beyond regulation in some countries, whether that's via high use of recycled content in those bottles or via the launch of, say, tethered caps. And that's really to demonstrate the serious attention they are paying to reducing plastic waste.
Well, Howard, Rosemarie mentions large players like PepsiCo or the Coca-Cola Company going beyond regulations. What are the specific actions and commitments by the players around the world to promote sustainability and meet or even go beyond environmental targets?
Yeah, well, we've had various commitments to reducing waste, generally promoting sustainability from these big suppliers, but also more transparency in terms of the reporting and measuring these efforts internally as well. But I'd also say the pace of action is still fairly dependent on what are the local or the regional attitudes and standards and legislation to sustainability. PepsiCo, for instance, they have an initiative now called PepsiCo Positive. They launched that last year. They're targeting net zero emissions by 2040. They're aiming to become a net water positive company by 2030. And importantly, they're also trying to cut virgin plastic per serving by half over the same time frame. The world's largest soft drinks company, of course, is Coca-Cola. They have a program called World Without Waste. They're aiming for a quarter of their global beverages in either refillable or returnable glass or plastic containers, or from fountain machines by 2030. And we're starting to see some tangible action on that front as well. There's some examples there from Rosemarie about the tethered closures. Coca-Cola Japan, for instance, have introduced water refill stations this year under their Bon Aqua purified water brand. You also have the Dasani PureFill system on some school campuses here in the US. And in both of those instances, the consumer is encouraged to actually use their own reusable bottle rather than a single-use package. And regionally, I'd say, as Rosemarie mentioned, things tend to be moving faster in Europe than they are elsewhere in the world. So PepsiCo are aiming for all rPET in the US by 2030, but they already claim that there are 11 markets in Europe that have moved to all rPET Pepsi beverages by the end of this year. And that's also going to have a consequent impact on the company's emissions targets. Coca-Cola Euro-Pacific Partners, who are the largest bottler of Coca-Cola products in Western Europe, they've also launched a compact freestyle fountain machine this year, which they claim is going to help to lower the carbon footprint in the region. And it's also going to be paired with a reusable container system in some of the locations. There are also these self-pour fountain systems they're experimenting with in the moment in institutional channels in Spain, which are again trying to limit the single-use packaging associated with the brand. And I think this push for package-free beverage consumption, that's going to continue to spill into institutional settings and workplaces, as well as potentially the retail and the kitchen countertop as well. So Coca-Cola Euro-Pacific Partners, again, have invested in Levit, which is a countertop beverage system. You have PepsiCo's investment in the SodaStream system, very famously as well, which is also a big part of their growth plans, particularly in Europe.
Package-free future sounds quite extreme today, especially post-pandemic, when it seems we went back to packing almost everything for safety reasons. Rosemarie, what is the current role of packaging in food and drinks sustainability regulations?
Thanks, Yurgita. Yes, true. Packaging, well, it's a really important source of sustainability regulation across food and drinks, as we've heard already talked about earlier in our conversation. And primary objective really being to reduce packaging waste, but also to optimize packaging material circularity. So we're talking about repeated reuse. So really to remove any single-use connotation. So in drinks, we know we have targeted regulation very much on those single-use plastic bottles with specific timelines to increase recycled plastic usage so that plastic does have a second, third, fourth life and so on, and to really substantially increase recycling rates of packaging. Plastic specific regulation is certainly becoming more widespread also across food and beverages and indeed across the wider grocery landscape as well. We see that through measures such as plastic taxation levied on plastic packaging that is not recyclable or does not meet a minimum threshold of recycled content. For example, from just April this year, users of plastic packaging in the UK that are using packaging containing less than 30% recycled content are now liable to pay £200 per tonne of material. So this, amongst many other taxes and levies being employed, are furthering brands' search, and we've heard lots of examples already, and commitment to recyclable packaging and recycled content or alternative materials or distribution systems. So just one other thought as well of a company, Unilever. So this is a company already a couple of years ago now has pledged to halve its use of virgin plastics. That's new plastic material by 2025. And we're seeing it making headway. So for instance, in ice cream, they've made a switch to recycled polypropylene, so recycled plastic tubs for their Magnum brand, and they're currently in the process then also of moving from plastic to paper-based tubs for cart door, and we're seeing examples already in the UK of that.
Thanks, Rosemarie. Well, recycling and circularity is also a very hot topic nowadays. What are the regulations to encourage companies moving away from linear business models towards more circular ones?
Indeed, Yogita, and yeah, recycling and circularity are absolutely core to brands, retailers, and packagers too, and to development of materials. And it's important to note we've spoken quite a bit on plastic, I realise, and packaging regulation is, not just about plastic, but very much about recycling and circularity. Although plastic has certainly been a real focus of recent and new legislation. But national, regional regulation very much covers all materials, so metal, glass, paper, as well as plastic. And I'd say the really core goals, if we think about circularity, is about recyclable packaging. It's about better design. It's about recovery, reuse, and we see those targets. So yes, it really is about getting rid of the linear model of take, make, dispose. That's the past, and really moving towards reuse or alternative models. So that's very much central in regulation and very much mirrored in food and beverage producers' pledges and in their innovations. And we've heard lots of examples already on that. So other areas of regulation, well, we've had country bans on the import, for instance, of low-grade packaging waste. And I suppose most significant in recent years was China's ban back in 2018. And there have been other countries since, really putting pressure now on countries to handle their own packaging waste locally. And we're seeing this translate into then more local national laws, but also into municipal and corporate programs to better fund the collection of packaging post-consumer use, its recycling, and initiatives for reuse locally. So there's a lot to do, but this is far better and more circular solution than having waste packaging material traveling thousands of miles to another continent to be recycled. We also have examples of supermarkets in many countries working with recyclers, taking back in store from consumers some packaging materials that are just not currently yet recycled or recyclable easily. If I look a little bit closer to home, if I look at Europe, we have the EU Circular Economy Action Plan, and that's all about all packaging, so every piece of packaging being recyclable or reusable by 2030. And this is going to present a challenge for some materials. If we think about some of the flexible plastic packaging materials, and that's really significant in the grocery landscape, think about snack packaging, pet food, coffee. For that all to be recyclable, we don't have the infrastructure in many countries. So the fact for these is there's work to be done. It's definitely going to be a topic for discussion. And as the EU's Packaging Waste Directive is up for review this year. So there's clear need for investment if these recyclability and recycling targets are to be met. But we also know there is plenty of action happening. And also positive businesses, really do seem to recognize this. In our latest Voice of the Industry Sustainability Survey from this year, 76% of companies said that they'll be investing in waste and recycling initiatives. And we know of examples that they are. So beyond established recycling methods, mechanical recycling, we're seeing more brands partnering with recyclers on advanced sorting and recycling methods, and quite a lot more collaboration. And I expect we will see plenty more of activity here just to improve that all-important material circularity and advance towards the circular economy.
Well, thanks, Rosemarie, for such an extensive answer. We've been talking a lot about regulators and businesses that have started taking actions to tackle sustainability challenges more proactively. What about us, consumers, and how big is our role in this process? Yeah, Maria.
Yeah, thank you, Yurgita. Definitely, consumers play a very, very important role. But I think that in order to have significant results, we need more consumer education. We need more education campaigns that can come from government institutions or non-governmental organizations. But these are essential, in my opinion, to raise awareness and to motivate and encourage consumers to act more sustainably and ultimately to facilitate more sustainable attitudes and lifestyles. And, as an example with food waste reduction, which we were talking about earlier, this could be done, for example, by promoting seasonal produce or, giving clearer explanations of food miles, the importance of local sourcing, but also embracing ugly fruits and vegetables rather than throwing away food that does not meet certain cosmetic standards. So this is just an example, but there is a lot that could be done here to educate consumers as their role, as I was saying, is very, very important here.
Okay, thanks, Maria. Let's talk about sustainable solutions in food and drinks industries. Howard, what are the sustainable yet affordable alternatives in drinks industry that would comply with regulations and help achieve or even exceed environmental targets while also satisfying the increasing demand from consumers at the same time?
Yeah, well, I think at the product level, at least, it starts with simpler ingredients, local sourcing of those ingredients, as Maria mentioned, encouraging seasonality where that's possible, and of course, processing or bottling closer to the consumer as well as some of the things we talked about, like encouraging reuse and returnable packaging as part of the mix. But particularly on the point of shorter supply lines and the use of ingredients that are closer to home, that might eventually mean exploring alternatives to coffee or to tea. So guayusa or mate in Latin America, yaupon, which is the only caffeinated plant in North America. These, that's less commonly used in beverages at the moment, but what we might need is more creativity in terms of potential beverage ingredients that are local, that have a sustainability focus. Maybe that could mean more use of botanicals or mushrooms or other herbal ingredients in hot drinks as well. And then longer term, synthetic alternatives, even so-called molecular coffee from producers like Atomo or Compound here in the US. These are engineered alternatives to these agricultural crops. Now, this could be difficult to scale up in the current environment, as we look at tighter funding for some of these independent food and beverages, but this is certainly on the table longer term.
And what about the alternatives, the sustainable alternatives in the foods industry, Maria?
Yeah, I mean, there is quite a few things that we could consider here. Something that I think is quite important is, reduction of consumption of animal-based products. As we know, plant-based diets have been booming recently. They've gained a lot of popularity in the last few years. And even if we look into our service, our recent health and nutrition survey that we had the results earlier this year shows that 42% of consumers globally claim to have meat or animal product eating restrictions, right? So, this is a key area where we could see more sustainable alternatives. Now, another key point, and this really connects with what just Howard just mentioned around shorter supply chains, and it's about reducing those food miles, by having more local supply chains where possible. This is obviously crucial because reducing this could help reduce the carbon footprint of the food we eat, but it's also important if we think about food security. We've seen a lot of supply chain shocks that are really impacting global trade and is posing important challenges to markets that are heavily reliant on imports. So there is a growing push by governments to invest, to promote, foster domestic food production from the sustainability perspective, but also because of food security. And then really connected to both points that I just mentioned around less animal based, but also local supply chains. And there are still regulation hurdles to overcome, but the long-term opportunities for lab-derived food, and that really connects as well with those synthetic alternatives that Howard was just mentioning. And in the food industry, this includes obviously cultured meat and dairy, but also fermentation techniques that we're seeing to replicate animal-based ingredients such as proteins or fats, for example. So far, we've seen this mostly being researched and developed in the dairy and meat industries, but there are also developments coming in lab-grown chocolate or honey, for example, to just name a couple of other examples. So these technologies are at the moment not affordable, not scalable, but thinking longer term, I think it would be an essential piece of the puzzle to produce more sustainable options and to shorten food supply chains as well. And really in the same vein, on the lab-derived food, we have the vertical farming. This is kind of like connected to this technology point, tech-related innovations, in which we can really produce fresher food that can be produced sustainably, year-round, in all environments, and contributing to that shorter supply chain as well.
This sounds exciting and expensive. Euromonitor's data shows that while consumers become more worried about environmental challenges, only 18% of them demonstrate a willingness to pay more for eco-friendly food and beverages. Howard, what are the ways, if any at all, to create the balance between sustainable offerings and affordable prices, and especially in the times with inflation reaching heights not seen since 80s?
Yeah, well, I think we have to acknowledge that it's difficult in the current environment. So if we're talking about things like plastic excise taxes and bottle deposits, that's going to add to the price, the end price of the product to the consumer. And so even if we think about, rapid rPET conversion that we're seeing on the packaging side, that can also contribute to inflationary pressure because demand for rPET is high, the capacity at the moment is low, and so the cost to manufacturers is expensive. As you mentioned, we know consumers want this. 60% of respondents in our lifestyle survey tell us they're trying to cut plastic use, but less than 20% in that same survey telling us they're willing to pay more for eco-friendly packaging. So, the industry have to control cost and keep the package affordable, even as it becomes a more sustainable package. One solution to that is what we call shrinkflation, and that's not popular with consumers. As we're cutting the package size, but smaller portions, of course, can reduce overall waste. They can create more pack unit affordability in inflationary environments as well. Another solution might be to standardize the packaging to promote circularity and to control costs, because you can remove the additional cost associated with having unique pack types and unique molds for each particular brand or SKU in your portfolio. So, for instance, there's now a 2.5 liter universal returnable bottle in Latin America that Coca-Cola's bottler FEMSA produce, that many of their brands can use. And returnables, certainly, if you look at Latin America or glass returnables in India and Nigeria and elsewhere, these are a much bigger part of the mix. They've also been identified recently as by Coke's leadership as a way to counter inflation and reduce costs. So we see investment in that as well. FEMSA, the Latin America bottler, have invested more than $500 million over the last couple of years in returnable production and capacity. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, Coke have this goal of a quarter of their volume being returnable or reusable by 2030. And even more simply, we might look at things like simply lighter weight packaging. So just less overall PET plastic overall, or less glass per unit, or smaller units overall. That can help to reduce costs. It can make the product lighter, can make it more e-commerce friendly as well. And all of that allows for more pricing flexibility and affordability for the consumer.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Howard, because, we've seen how sustainability initiatives really mean, that the prices of the end products are more expensive than, regular offerings, but also we know how consumers are more and more price sensitive. So really, some of the points highlighted by Howard are very relevant as well in food and the packaging and shrinkflation and so forth. I think it is also important, maybe I would add here, to consider areas where we've seen consumers have a very high interest, because this could help minimize price sensitivity to some degree. So, for example, when we look into our most recent lifestyle survey and we are asking consumers about the activities that they do to positively impact the environment, we can identify some markets that select reducing food waste as the top priority for them. And, we see consumers in Italy, France, Singapore, China, to name just a few, where they select this reduction of food waste as a top priority. So, maybe this is an area where, because they have that high interest, could help minimize that price sensitivity. But also, I think initiatives around promoting, I was mentioning earlier, seasonal production or embracing ugly fruits and vegetables, this doesn't necessarily add cost to the consumer and contributes hugely to the environment as well. And indeed, we've seen initiatives as well coming from manufacturers or from retailers alike to, in connection to this price sensitivity. There is an initiative coming from Asda, the retailer Asda in the UK, which is called Greener at Asda Price. And this is a price promise that loose and unwrapped products will not cost more than their wrap equivalents at any of their stores. So obviously, these initiatives will really benefit consumer adoption, and they're really crucial.
Oh, thank you, Maria Howard. Very interesting. Let's talk about the future to wrap up our discussion. So what actions and commitments related to environmental sustainability need to be taken by the food and drinks industry players now, so the future is bright for them?
Yeah, definitely. So, to be honest, and we've highlighted quite a few areas already, but most companies have already taken action on sustainability. And we've also talked about upcoming regulation, or some of it already in place. So this is indeed a must. For example, some of the world's largest food manufacturers, we're talking about food waste a second ago. So, manufacturers such as Nestle, Danone, Pepsi, Mondelez, Unilever, just to name a few, are part of an initiative which is called the 10-20-30 initiative, which brings together 10 of the world's biggest food manufacturers and retailers to each engage with 20 of their priority suppliers, with the goal of cutting food loss and waste in their own operations and supply chain by half by 2030. So this is an area obviously of focus. Then we have many food manufacturers also setting targets to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. In this space, for example, Unilever has been more ambitious and has set to achieve this by 2039. But there is also initiatives in place to assure that suppliers of key commodities such as cocoa, palm oil, soybeans are 100% deforestation free. So this is obviously a very important area in the spotlight. And also investments going into supporting the transition to regenerative agriculture. So really a lot of areas are here in the mix. But I also think it's very important the tech-related innovation that we were talking earlier. The fermentation to replicate animal-based ingredients, the lab culture, synthetic alternatives, vertical farming. I think all of these are areas that should be kept in the spotlight. And although they might be more towards like the long term, it's not something so immediate. But the future of food, if this tech-related innovation is scalable, might mean that production will depend less on fields and more on technology. So yeah, I do believe this is a very important area as well.
Well, thanks, Maria. And thank you, Rosemarie Howard, as well, for joining me today. I hope our listeners enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. And while our newest report on environmental sustainability regulation, a cross-industry view, provides many more insights on regulatory environment across major FMCG industries, Euromonitor International sustainability solutions go beyond regulations, bringing together expertise from across our business to help you create effective sustainability strategies, prioritize countries, categories, and even claims for sustainable product expansion, analyze competitors, and many more. Please contact us for more data-driven insights on sustainability at euromonitor.com. Thank you for listening.